really what I want to do is to spend about 20 minutes or so talking about this subject of, so I'll say BAME, so Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic communities, but it might be that there's a different term that's used. So sometimes people talk about BME, Black, Minority, Ethnic, sometimes it's BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, and now often I come across BAME, so it's Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic refugees. And I'm also aware of the fact that, in some countries, it might be used things like, people of color, they might say, or communities of color. So different terminologies used, but basically what it really implies is the minority within the community. So whoever we are, it might be I don't know, migrant communities that who've come into our country, and they will carry some different characteristics to us. So a lot of what I talk about should be able to be relatable across the board, for any of our for communities. But I really don't want it to become like a formal presentation. So hopefully I'm going to try and whiz through this, and then we can come back to it if there's any questions or, anything that you want to raise, anything that's similar, those kind of things. So that should be quite interesting. One of the things which I really find interesting is that, and this isn't necessarily about my PhD research, so I'm in my final year in a write-up stage, or my work experience. So for about 19 years, I worked for our local council, the local authority, as a manager looking at information, health and social care. But I think lived experience is always important, and it doesn't matter who we are, where we are. Some of these things I'm going to talk about, if you just kind of have a bit of a think about, your city, your community, your neighborhood, you'll see that there's lots of things that might be similar, but yet different. And almost like one of the first things that I like to ask people is that, what's their ethnicity? And it tends to confuse some people sometimes, because we tend to think of ethnics or ethnicity as people who are different to us. But actually the English language talks about ethnic minorities. So quite clearly, if there's an ethnic minority, there's a ethnic majority. So we're all ethnics, and then we have to start to try and define what do we mean by that. But within our identities, depending on who we're talking to and where we're talking, it might be that we use different identities. So I might choose to be, so I'm British born. My mum and dad came from Pakistan. So I might choose to be a British Pakistani. I might choose to be British. I might say I'm not English. I'm in England, I'm born in England, but I might feel that the culture there is not the same as my culture. My culture might be very different. It might be that at times I might say that, I'm a Yorkshireman, I'm born in Yorkshire, and I have a Yorkshire accent depending on where I am as to how strong it might be. But there are like local, regional, national identities that people might have. And this also then brings me to the point that how we see people different is that we apply certain identities to folk that they may or may not use themselves. So again, I don't really know about Australia, but certainly across Europe and in Britain often, there's quite a lot of talk around, the Muslim community and the Muslims. There's lots of work being done around things like Islamophobia. There's some issues happening in France at the moment. And I think sometimes our preconceived ideas based on how we get the information, the education, and where we get it from can skew or prejudice our thinking. So that prejudice thinking then starts to impact on how we think of the other. And also the other aspect, I suppose, about labels is that communities, so when I say communities, I'm talking about, whether it's families, it's neighborhoods, it's a city, it's a country, that communities may not use the same labels as we might. So we might talk about carers, but the carer doesn't actually identify themselves as a carer. So you might ask somebody, so, what identity might they use? Well, actually, I'm his wife, I'm the son, I'm the daughter, I'm the husband, you will probably have formal carers so paid carers who will identify them as carers because that's the role that they do, that's their vocation, that's their job. But where you have family people undertaking care, it's often really difficult for them to accept the fact that they have this label that identifies them as a carer. And the language that's important here within identity is not just about the language that we might speak as somebody who may be native to a place, or whether I speak English, or the fact that my mum and dad, having come from Pakistan, I can speak Urdu and I can speak Punjabi. I have friends who are of the Arab world, so there's bits of Arabic that I'll know. My point really here is about the jargon that's often used in language. So technical words, jargon that's, not familiar to people at a lay level. So in Britain, often they talk about the average the reading age is about 7 to 9 year olds. And as a former chair of governors of a primary school here in Bradford, I can tell you that actually, I think in some respects that's quite a disservice, because if you were to look at the level that's required for SATs for an 11-year-old, many, if not most, adults would actually find quite difficult. So I think there's something there. So I'm going to kind of continue through this to try and whiz through so we can have some conversations, trying to work out how I move this on, or click. Okay, so in terms of diversity, people often hear, diverse communities, but we now really talk about super diversity, and super diversity comes from the fact that there are diverse communities within communities, or the fact that our communities that we could identify were much clearer in the past than they are now. So if we were to look at some of these communities that I've just kind of highlighted, and I'm just going to take you through some of this, sometimes the language, as I just mentioned, dictates rights or citizenship, whatever. And it might be that, and I tend to try and say as things are, rather than try and be politically correct in some respects, is that if you tend to be brown or black, you tend to be called a migrant. If you tend to be white, you're an expat, So whether that's in the Middle East, or it's in Europe, you've gone and settled in New Zealand, whatever it might be, then depending on often the color of your skin, it's whether you are seen to be a migrant. So you are coming into my country, you're taking, I don't know, jobs, housing, money, whatever it might be, or you're an expat. So that in itself is quite interesting. However, just coming back to super diversity, is that in Britain, for instance, we knew that the West Indian kind of communities from the Caribbean came in, late 40s. Then in the 50s, 60s, we had Indians, Pakistanis coming in the 70s, early 70s, from East Pakistan, it became Bangladesh, so a lot of the Bangladeshi community would come in there. So we could identify communities coming through. Actually, now we have communities within communities that we can't really identify, refugees and asylum seekers. So this is where the term super diversity comes from. And later on, I'll say something about why this is important to identify and understand who are our communities. Because if we can't understand who they are, then we can't really work with them in terms of what their needs might be. But we also have very different communities. So if you think of like North and South Europe, you may have, in like say France, you might have Tunisians, Moroccans, but in maybe Italy, for example, you might have people from Cameroon. So even though they might be from Africa, there'll be very different communities. And also the fact that we may, well, there's a bit of a problem that we create really, that we can put the whole of Africa and the Caribbean together and say, somebody's African Caribbean, not really knowing which country they might be from, and those are big places. Whereas our own communities, we're very clear, say across Europe, whether somebody's, I don't know, from Belgium as a small country, from Wales, a small country, we don't tend to just say the European, irrespective of the politics that's going on at the moment. But anyway, so my point really here is that within super diversity, we're talking of communities that might be invisible, like the Irish, because they may be Christian, fair skin, as white communities. Their heritage may be, I don't think dismissed is the right word that I want to use there, but they can be hidden communities. So people may be oblivious to what their needs might be. So these aren't homogenous communities, the same communities. These are heterogeneous communities, so they're different in lots of ways. This picture kind of went through the arrows as I presented it once before, so Kate will have probably seen this, but I've just used it as a picture here, just to give you an idea that if you just took South Asian communities in Britain, and this isn't all of them, this is just those that may come from Pakistan, Kashmir, India, Bangladesh, you could see, depending on their ethnicity, their faith, their language, it's a really complex situation to decide how you might create information for somebody. So if we said that somebody, for example, is an Urdu speaker, well, we could tell that actually they could be Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, they could be Christian, and they could be coming from Pakistan, Kashmir, India, Bangladesh. But there might be something very specific. So it might be that those that speak Gurumukhi Punjabi, which is a written language, and the Punjabi that's Mirpuri isn't a written language, that you could follow that through, I think, to say that actually they're likely to be, Punjabi speakers of a Sikh faith that have their heritage in India. So that's much more clear cut. But the picture hopefully shows you how complex it can be. And when then you add other communities, it really complicates things. Even with South Asia, if we talk about, Sri Lanka, whether somebody's from, Nepal, Bhutan, those kind of communities, it really complicates things. So just a bit of a quick overview of this. In the UK, for example, it's very late that we've started to record ethnicity. Fairly recently, a few years back, we started to record it, and it was being recorded, if I'm honest, I think it's because of something around paying £50 to the GP practice for each person that was identified, and it's still quite guesstimate work. So they reckon there's something like 20 to 25,000 people in the UK who have a BAME background, Black Asian minority ethnic background, but it's guesswork. However, what we do know, and research tells us, that in the next sort of 30 years, there's going to be a 7 to 8-fold increase. Now that 7 to 8-fold increase isn't just about people with dementia. So if you think about families, carers, there's going to be an increase because there will be family carers who will be caring for these people that would have dementia. So the need for support would also increase at the same amount. In terms of communities, there's no real in-depth awareness of dementia. So many carers will tell you, and there are carers and former carers on our webinar today, they will tell you that access to information is really difficult. And part of the problem there is that the service providers have no real understanding of communities. So the carers may struggle, and people with dementia may struggle to get the information, but those who should be providing the information don't understand the community, so they don't really provide the information. And I was just saying at the start, just before we started, it's interesting that, and Shahid's on this webinar, on Twitter, we've had a really interesting conversation in the last sort of 24 hours or so, where our Public Health England have been putting information out in Urdu around COVID for the Urdu speakers, readers, without checking the information that's gone out. And it's back to front characters. It's not in the right order. It doesn't make sense. It's not, legible in the font that's used and so forth. So lots of things can go wrong. So they have no understanding of community needs. There isn't that real engagement. People say that communities can be hard to reach. And we would tell you that actually it isn't about hard to reach. This is about you coming out of your comfort zone to say, look, I don't know, I put my hand up, I want to ask, I want to work with you, so we can always get through to people. We also know that BAME communities tend to present late. Carers don't usually ask for help. They may not understand that they're a carer. The person with memory problems, with dementia, may not have a diagnosis, but it's only when they're at crisis they might go to the doctor, to their GP, general practitioner, and say, actually, we can't cope. And even then, what they might be looking for is there any magic pills to fix things, rather than looking at self-care and managing things long term. And the other thing about BAME communities often is that because of lifestyles, their health situations often quite complex. There's lots of comorbidities. So, somebody might have high blood pressure, they may have diabetes, they may have, coronary heart problems. And then, along comes dementia just to complicate everything that's already complicated. Okay, why is it important? Obviously, for every country, it's important that we're looking at population demographics. So migrant community numbers tend to increase. Why? Because they've come from one country to another country, having their family. So it's often younger people that come first. So the population numbers will grow. And if they're more likely to have dementia, then we know that the need will be that much more. Globally, there's an increase in dementia. So it's not just about migrant communities, but globally, we then have pressure on services. So lots of research that's going on around care and cure. So my work really is around the care element, that, let those people who are working on the cure to work on the cure, but those people who have dementia, those people who are living with that, those people who are, carers of a relative or a friend that has dementia, we need to be supporting those communities, those carers and those people. The understanding community, oops, I think it's because I've just clicked that. Understanding of communities, I've mentioned, so I'm not really going to go over that so much, but the point really is that you get your information services right if you understand communities. It's important to understand intersectionality, and that is that when we provide services, we tend to pigeonhole people. So we may say that this is their ethnicity. So if you think about that slide that talks about identities, so somebody might be identified as, well, actually they're a disabled person, or you know, they're a gay person, or they're a, you know, certain faith or certain gender. We tend to sort of put people into silos, but all of us, we don't live in that way. You know, we are complicated in the sense that, you know, I don't know, I might be Muslim, Pakistani heritage, straight, single, whatever. That's me. So things have to work around me. But it might be that somebody has difficulties because of their disability and their gender and their ethnicity, and that might impact how they may access services or how might, you know, they engage with you. So it's about looking at the whole person rather than putting people into boxes. And then this other thing we often talk about, kind of like a cultural bias, or we carry prejudice, and the term white privilege is often used. And the importance of understanding that is that our lived experience, how we grow up, where we grow up, the education that we have, the privilege that we might have, where, for example, we may not see the difficulties. Let's say, for example, in England, we see that lots more of the black community end up in mental health services. So why is that? The stop and search by police tends to be much more younger black men than other groups. But our expectations might also be that certain things we think that people are very good at. So, you know, we might think, oh, the Chinese community, kids are so clever. Indian, Hindu communities, you know, they're going to be, you know, business people. You know, many of these communities, they might just look after their own. And this looking after their own often becomes a big problem in terms of our presentation today on dementia, is that if the social worker, the doctor, the district nurse, whoever they are, the decision makers about services, the budget holders, if they think that these communities look after their own, then they're not going to open doors for them to access services. So they themselves become gatekeepers. And what they tend to say is there's gatekeepers in the community. So when they talk about community leaders, I hate that term. There are community champions, of course they are, but none of us really have community leaders, because if the white communities don't have leaders, how come the brown ones do? And if the brown ones do, then why don't the white ones? So do you see where I'm coming from? We're pretty much similar. We may look after our own if we're struggling and we don't know where to go, but that doesn't mean to say that actually we're doing really well in looking after them if there is that need of support. Just very quickly to touch on this migratory influence, is that communities, when they migrate from one place to another, just imagine that if you then an older person, you're regressing in terms of your language that you had as a child, your culture. So in this new place, you might have lived here 50 years, you know, it becomes a problem. Language also, the older person may be then speaking in their first language, but they've got second, third generation who speak English, for example. And how do they communicate if the youngsters then don't speak the community language? Racism I've just talked about in terms of like institutions and how they might become gatekeepers, but often services tend to work on a one-size-fits-all, and I think that's part of the problem. If we don't understand these complex needs within communities, and we tend to say, well, you know, our service is there and the doors are open, my point would be, well, if they don't know who you are, what you offer, why would they come in? And there is a real example. I used to work for social services. My manager's manager once had asked me why the Asian community here in Bradford wasn't using the council's residential homes, so the council housing for older people, basically. And that might be for respite, or it might be that they're struggling. And I just sort of looked at him and I thought, and you're asking me. So I said, well, if you was to drive past a mosque or a temple or gurdwara, do you know what happens inside that? No. I said, so if you don't understand that, how do they know what happens in your institutions? Because they're just driving past. So it's about us being open-minded, really. Impact on services, I just touched on the fact that you know, as numbers increase, there'll be more demand on services, but you can see from here there's a huge cost to the economy, whether that's people ending up needing social care, hospital care, medicines. You know, these issues will impact on us as countries, so it's important that we get things right and we support carers at home. If we're managing comorbidities, I think there's a problem, and again, it's a real problem that I've seen here locally, is that GPs may be talking about managing the existing comorbidities. So for them, dementia isn't as important, and they might be saying, well, people with dementia tend to be in some kind of institution, or they're in hospitals, or they're bedbound. Whereas what we're talking about is supporting people to live well, and to support people to live well means that they also need to understand what are the dynamics around dementia and care for dementia. So how do we support carers to look after themselves, but also the people in their care? And in terms of assessments, it's still a huge issue when I look at culturally appropriateness of assessments. So if they're checking for memory assessment, for example, are they culturally appropriate? Do they ask the kind of questions that people will understand? And I use this example often, that if you were to ask my mum, so my mum's 70, ask her about Winston Churchill, she wouldn't have a clue. But if I was to ask, an English person, do they know the name of, Gandhi's full name, or Mohammed A Rauf MBE of Pakistan, what his sister was called? Well, my mum would know, but somebody with a degree from England probably won't know. So I think it's quite relative in terms of the kind of questions that we might be asking. Some of these things around the complexities are, and I touched on the fact that there may not be awareness of dementia in communities, even though we've done lots of work. Somebody said something to me once, and actually it really struck home, is that people don't need information when we're giving information, they need information when they need information, and there's a huge difference there. So we have to be prepared to make information available to people that they can access it when they need. I've touched on literacy levels earlier on, so I'm not really going to talk much more about that. Socioeconomic deprivation, really, so about the finances in people's pockets. Minority communities, so BAME communities tend to be, so if we think of migrant communities, they tend to go to the cheaper, poorer areas within cities, so it'd be inner city areas, so housing is poorer, jobs that tend to be the lower end rather than big bucks, big wage jobs. So when it comes to care, then you don't necessarily have that disposable income to buy the service and the care that you need. So there may be more of a reliance on services that are available to us. There's also some really interesting work being done around cultural obligations and willingness. So are these carers willing to care, or do they feel they are culturally obliged to have to care? So the example here is a daughter-in-law that's living in an extended family. She might need to be, caring for her children. She's got to get to school. She may have a part-time job. She might also be having to, cook dinner and lunch for the person that's in care. So I don't know, say father-in-law has dementia, for example. Her husband comes along. So does that lady have a voice? Does she have that support? So it might be that people are obliged to have to care without being willing to care, and there might be people who are willing to care but actually don't really have a clue as to how they should undertake care. And again, from some of my own research, there's work that really needs to be unpicked around generational differences and gender issues. So somebody who's born in Britain, say a sibling, a sister and a brother, they may not necessarily see things in terms of culture. They may see things in terms of equality, that, well, actually, if I'm doing it, so should he. If I'm having to do this, then he should have to do this. Or the other way of, well, actually, they live with him, so he should be making decisions. Whereas what you might often find is that the parent with dementia maybe is living with one child, and that child's siblings, so the children of that family, they may be living in their own families, but actually they keep inputting, and the carer within the home doesn't really have a lot of say. So there's some stuff to be unpacked there. Stigma within families is huge, but also there is community stigma, and the understanding of what is dementia, what is care, what should families do. So if we talk about social construction, is how do they come to that knowledge? How do they learn about what does it mean to be a carer? What is dementia? And what I should have said is, within the main 5 South Asian languages, so if you think about 1,000 miles across from Pakistan to Bangladesh, there is no real word for dementia. So you're already talking about something that isn't easily recognized. Usually if something has a name, it's easier to talk about. So people didn't used to know about depression, for example, but now everybody understands it as depression. So that word is used. In the same way we used to talk about cancer, everybody say, the C word. Now that C word, everybody's okay talking about cancer. And maybe now we've got the D word because people don't really understand dementia. They're frightened of dementia. as much as we talk about living well with dementia, people sort of think, actually, that's it. You know, if I get a diagnosis, that's it. And in terms of faith, some of my research also tells me that there are people who see it as traditional, which means that they see caring as virtuous. It's good for the soul. And then there are those who see it as a burden, that why are they being punished to have to care? Or is the person that's got dementia being punished by God because they may have done bad things, so therefore perhaps they deserve it? So understanding those faith-based influences can help carers. I'm going to skip that migratory influence because we talked about migration on the other slide. Culture, you know, whether individuals see that this person is, you know, just behaving odd, or are they acting deliberately? So some of that is being unpacked in research, that people tend to, if they don't understand it, they think it might be some deliberate behavior. And others think, actually, this is so bizarre that let's kind of keep them locked in, and, you know, other people don't know that we've got somebody that in our home that's crazy. But the more we normalize dementia, the easier it is to support carers and to support the people who are then living with dementia. Notions of respect, for example, we're saying that independence is something that is valued in Western world. So if you look at Eurocentric kind of approaches, it's about the individual, it's about your freedom, it's about your independence. Whereas in some of the Eastern cultures, whether it's African, if it's Asian, is that the family, the community is a stronger unit than you, the individual. So, you know, what they think, what they want is often stronger than what you want. I touched on stigma, you know, again, just to remind people that the worry about what somebody else thinks can impact on your ability to access information, access services. And not understanding dementia often goes down two roads. One is either thinking, actually, it's a normal part of the aging process, or people think that there's witchcraft here, that somebody's possessed by jinns, so jinns are about spirits, and so this person's crazy. And so therefore they may not go to the doctor to try and seek some sort of medical support or respite type of support. Duty to care is about obligations, willingness, but there are issues around gender. Home-based support, people tend to think that if they get some financial support and changes to the home, so maybe a shower or you know, a bathroom downstairs, that they are happy to continue to care at home rather than to take space up in like care institutions. So whether it's nursing care, whether it's respite care or in a residential home, people tend to want to have support at home. So there's some work to be done around you know, planning for the future, around housing designs and so forth. And this thing about, but what if, is that the carer will often think about, what about when I can't cope anymore? How will I make that decision? I can hide this person at home, I can try and manage as best I can. And this is where I said earlier on that people tend to go to the GP at crisis point, and even then they won't say, actually, we need, you know, lots of support. They will ask for some kind of a quick fix. And I know from a local hospital that people tend to go through accident and emergency. You know, somebody may have, I don't know, a UTI, an infection, rather than kind of accepting that the dementia has progressed to such an extent that they can't cope with that support anymore at home. So that moves us towards the kind of the end of life thing, that whether institutions need to try and support care at home or help outside. And that, I think, about I added it here, to, you know, do the best, is that both of them can try and do something which works well for the individual. So a bit of a run through, there's just lots of different areas that we can talk about, but I kind of want to give some space for us to have a conversation. So my details are there. I'm quite active on Twitter, so I've gone to put the two Twitter handles on there. We have a website that's got lots of different bits of information.